Well, these tanks are, of course, much more sophisticated than those tanks the German army and the Soviet army had 40 years ago. And today, all our forces in Central Europe are fully mechanized forces. But in those days, we had only about 10% Panzer, tank, or mechanized forces on both sides. And still, these 10% bore the brunt of the battle. Their tactics were decisive for the outcome of many operations, especially the defensive operations. And therefore, I think, even 40 years later, it is quite appropriate to study not only the theoretical, doctrinal principles of those tactics, but also the skills, the practical skills of commanders and troops, of those commanders and troops who stem for more than 4 years the tide of this numerically vastly superior enemy.
The German army, which inflicted lightning defeats on Poland in September 1939 and Western Europe in June 1940, was spearheaded by panzer forces which had been in existence for only 4 years. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 had prohibited the development of modern offensive weapons by Germany after World War I, and so the first 3 panzer divisions formed in 1935 were disguised as motor demonstration commands, and the first tank as a light agricultural tractor. This did not prevent far-sighted officers, such as Colonel Heinz Guderian, from studying the writings of leading British exponents of armoured warfare, Fuller and Liddell Hart. He used armoured cars, motorcycles, anti-tank guns and dummy tanks in exercises which may have looked primitive, but were vital in developing command and control techniques, particularly radio. The first 3 models of German tanks were all lightly armed and lightly armoured. However, the Panzer IV weighed 18 tons and had a top speed of 35 kilometers per hour. Its gun was the somewhat inaccurate short-barreled 75mm. Despite its shortcomings, it became the standard tank of the German army and remained in production until the end of the Second World War. While the Germans were experimenting with dummy tanks, the Soviets had already begun creating powerful armoured forces. By 1932, Soviet industry was turning out 3,000 armoured fighting vehicles per month. By 1935, the Red Army already possessed 4 mechanized corps, each with 1 rifle and 2 tank divisions. However, Soviet armour made a poor showing in the Spanish Civil War, and it was decided to disband the unwieldy tank corps. The Winter War against Finland was another disaster, and gave the Germans an exaggerated view of the Red Army's incompetence. Before the tank corps could be completely disbanded, they were given a reprieve. In June 1940, German panzer formations cut a swathe across Western Europe, and even the powerful French army and British Expeditionary Force could not halt them. In July 1940, in response to the German victories, the Red Army ordered the formation of 29 tank corps, each with 1,000 or more tanks. However, not a single one of these new tank corps had completed its formation by the time the Germans struck. For example, the 14th Tank Corps of the Western Military District, formed in March 1941 with an establishment of 1,023 tanks, including the new heavy KV and medium T-34, could only field 508 tanks, most of which were worn-out T-26s. In June 1941, the Soviet Union had about 5 million men under arms. 3 million of these were to be found in the 170 formations and supporting units deployed in the west of the country. The Air Force, which was not a separate arm, had 1,500 modern planes and thousands of obsolete ones. Soviet Russia's western borders ran 4,500 kilometers from the Barents Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The 3,375 kilometers of land frontier was defended by 56 divisions to a depth of about 50 kilometers. The second echelon, containing most of the tank formations, was to be found anywhere from 50 to 100 kilometers behind the frontier. The reserves, which also included a number of mechanized corps, were deployed from 150 to 400 kilometers from the frontier. At the outbreak of World War II, in September 1939, the German army had 70 active divisions, 13 of which were classified as motorized. The 5 panzer divisions were each composed of a panzer brigade with 2 panzer regiments, each with 2 panzer battalions, each with 4 companies of light tanks, and a motorized infantry brigade with 2 rifle regiments, each with 2 battalions. In 1940, the number of panzer divisions was doubled, but the tank strength of each was halved by reducing the number of light and medium tanks and replacing them by fewer, heavier models with increased firepower. The infantry component was increased, and this made a more balanced formation. Before dawn on the 22nd of June 1941, 152 German divisions, including 19 panzer and 14 motorized divisions and 29 satellite divisions totaling some 5.5 million men, invaded the Soviet Union. This huge force was divided into 3 army groups spearheaded by the panzer divisions. Army Group North, von Leeb, was to advance northeastwards to Leningrad, while its northern flank was to trap Soviet forces with their backs to the Baltic Sea. Army Group Center, von Bock, was to take the most direct route from Brest-Litovsk to Smolensk over the river Dnieper, and either north to Leningrad or straight on to Moscow, a distance, as the crow flies, of 1,000 kilometers. Army Group South, von Rundstedt, was to advance with its 600 tanks on Kiev and the Dnieper Valley and destroy all Soviet forces between the Pripyat marshes and the Black Sea.
Es ging früh um 4 Uhr ging der Artillerieangriff los und wir sind ungefähr zwischen 6 und 7 Uhr früh über diese Brücke gefahren, die von der Infanterie eingenommen worden war. Es war kein sehr großer Feindwiderstand. Es waren einige leichte russische Panzer da, Schwimmpanzer, die für uns alle kein Problem bedeuteten. Wir sind ziemlich zügig vorwärts gefahren in Richtung nach Berdychev, was das Angriffsziel war. Und wir haben kaum geschlafen, das ging eigentlich Tag und Nacht durch mit Luftwaffenunterstützung, bis wir vor Berdychev auf die ersten T-34 stießen.
Meine Gedanken beim Überschreiten der russischen Grenze waren wie folgt. Wir waren eine sehr erfahrene alte Panzerdivision, hatten in Polen und in Frankreich gekämpft und fühlten uns überlegen über jeden Gegner. Die Russen waren für uns kein wirklicher Gegner. Dieser Eindruck änderte sich sehr schnell am allerersten Tage. Wir gingen bei Tauroggen über die Grenze und dort trafen wir auf die russischen Grenzschutzverbände, die so hart fochten, dass wir am Mittag des ersten Tages schon alle Munition in den Panzer IV verschossen hatten.
In the first days of war, German forces were advancing very swiftly, and this put the entire staff of the Red Army in a state of shock, as it were. This state of shock stayed with us for quite a long time. As far as I know, the Soviets weren't organized to fight until July or even the beginning of August. This was in the region of Staraya Russa, to the west of Novgorod. But before that, let's say in July, the Soviet army was retreating in such chaos that reconnaissance of the northwestern front had to send special detachment to find out not where the enemy was positioned, but where the Soviet units, their own army, was.
Air superiority was another decisive factor. By midday on the 22nd of June 1941, the Luftwaffe had attacked 66 airfields and destroyed some 800 aircraft on the ground. Thereafter, the Germans enjoyed almost complete air superiority. As the armored spearheads penetrated deeper into Soviet territory, they began to experience not only increasingly bitter resistance, but the other problems of waging war in Russia. Vast distances, heat, dust, exhaustion, and wear and tear on vehicles and equipment. In many ways, the Soviet Union was an ideal country for armored warfare. But the enormous distances lowered the morale of the infantrymen, who had to march most of the way, so that the foot soldier often went into battle already exhausted. Russia had many roads, but only one metalled highway from Brest-Litovsk to Moscow. The other roads were little more than tracks. The wooden bridges which crossed the many streams and rivers were often too weak to take the weight of heavy military traffic. The Soviet railway system left much to be desired. Since the tracks were a wider gauge, every kilometer of line had to be narrowed. The few railheads assumed considerable strategic and tactical importance. Once supplies had been offloaded, they might then have to be transported as much as 500 kilometers by road to the front. By the autumn of 1941, the Red Army had suffered a series of shattering defeats and encirclements, and its losses in material and men were astronomical.
Поэтому нужно сказать, что мораль была настолько низкая.
The morale of the troops was so low that at the beginning of the war, some Soviet divisions and even some armies encircled by the Germans didn't even try to fight back, but gave themselves up. Never before in the whole history of Russia had anyone seen full-blooded, fully armed divisions or corps surrender without a shot being fired.
At this critical phase of the operation, when the Germans had reached the line Leningrad, Smolensk, Kiev, there was a conflict of opinion. Hitler became increasingly concerned with the economic and political objectives, such as the far-off Caucasian oil fields and the Ukrainian cornfields. The field commanders insisted that the first priority must be the destruction of the Red Army. The generals, particularly Guderian, wanted to press on to Moscow, but 3 vital weeks passed before Hitler finally decided on the Ukraine. The Panzer forces were redeployed in the Ukraine, and Army Group South, reinforced by Guderian's tanks, advanced into the Crimea. The offensive against Moscow was finally resumed on the 30th of September 1941. The sudden switch took the Soviets by surprise, and soon huge Red Army forces found themselves encircled at Bryansk and Vyazma. When, on the 16th of October, these pockets surrendered, Army Group Center had taken 1.5 million prisoners since the beginning of the campaign. The way to Moscow appeared to be wide open. But when the first ominous fall of snow suddenly melted, the roads dissolved into a quagmire, and the German advance was reduced to an average of 12 kilometers a day.
Es war so viel und so tiefer Schlamm, dass man außer mit großen Zugmaschinen nicht fahren konnte. Also Panzer konnten fahren, Zugmaschinen konnten fahren, aber kein LKW mit Sprit oder Munition. Es war also keine Möglichkeit vorzukommen. Daraufhin mussten wir warten, bis der Grund wieder gefroren war. Und als der Frost anfing, sind wir dann nach Moskau gestartet. Und wir sind ziemlich zügig vorangekommen bis zum Straßenkreuz nördlich Moskau, ungefähr 25 Kilometer von Moskau entfernt. Und da setzte dann eine eisige Kälte ein, einmal, und dann auch ein sehr starker russischer Widerstand. Und die Kälte war so groß, wurden dabei.
Er war der zu der Zeit überhaupt keinerlei Winterklamotten. Winter besonders schlimm. Was die Fahrzeuge betraf, so hatten wir Schwierigkeiten, die allmorgendlich überhaupt zum Anspringen zu bringen. Wir mussten teilweise unter dem Motor ein Feuer entfachen, weil auch mit dem Schwungkraftanlasser die Wagen sonst nicht zu starten gewesen wären. Alles war zu fest gewesen im Öl.
The Germans had fought their way over 900 kilometers, and Moscow was just 30 kilometers away when on the 6th of December 1941, with temperatures below minus 30 degrees centigrade, the offensive was called off. The Soviet Supreme Command sensed that the Germans had shot their bolt, and with reinforcements arriving from the Far East, the Red Army went on to the offensive.
Das Traurige für uns und das Erstaunliche war, dass die Russen mit ihrem T-34 die Kälte überhaupt nicht beachteten. Die sibirischen Divisionen, die kamen hier nach Europa und schüttelten sich und sagten, bruh, wie warm, und bekämpften uns. Der Rückzug machte uns natürlich deprimierter, als wir sowieso schon waren. Zum ersten Mal fühlten wir, dass wir geschlagen wurden.
In appalling weather, and despite Hitler's categoric order not to give up a single meter of Soviet territory, the Germans were pushed back until they were able to establish a line east of Smolensk, south to the Meuse River. There they remained until operations could be resumed again in the spring. Despite the optimism which continued to prevail in the Führer's headquarters, not one of Hitler's primary objectives had been attained. Leningrad and Moscow had not fallen, while in the south much of the Ukraine lay beyond Germany's reach. In many ways, the Soviets had contributed to their own defeats during the first months of the campaign. By attempting a linear defense of every kilometer of their vast frontier, they had spread out their forces so that the Germans were always able to achieve overwhelming superiority in the areas of their main effort. By placing their reserves so far back, rudimentary communications, bad roads, lack of motor transport and inexperienced commanders meant that they were easily outfought by more flexible and mobile German forces.
Система управления в советских полках и дивизиях.
The whole command system of Soviet regiments and divisions is based on the principle of very strict subordination from top to bottom. That extremely strict subordination existed before the war, so the whole of the officer corps was trained to execute very precisely the orders received from above. But just before the war, many senior officers had been liquidated in Stalin's purges, and the newly promoted senior officers were quite unprepared to show initiative. Anyhow, they were not expected to show initiative. Forbidden by military regulations, which specified that each officer and each man was only to execute the orders of his immediate was considered risky.
Like the Russian Civil War heroes Budyonny, Voroshilov, when it came to marshalling vast armies in the era of the tank. The Germans had to come to terms with the fact that in the T-34, the Soviets possessed an armored fighting vehicle which was far superior to anything they had.
Ich war damals Gefreiter in einem Panzer II, der sowieso Panzer nicht abschießen konnte. Und im Kessel von Uman sahen wir zum ersten Mal T-34 und waren begreiflicherweise erstaunt, was das für Panzer sind. Vor allen Dingen die Qualität der Panzerung und der Konstruktion, sodass diese Panzer praktisch nur frontal von der 8,8 Flak und von der Seite von 5 cm oder 7,5 abgeschossen werden konnte. Also zum Beispiel 3,7 Pack konnte dem mehr oder weniger gar nichts anhaben.
Wir mussten uns darauf einstellen, dass wir mit den zur Panzerbekämpfung dienenden Waffen, der 3,7 Kampfwagenkanone und der 5 cm Kampfwagenkanone, den T-34 praktisch nicht erledigen konnten. Unsere schweren Kompanien mit der 7,5 cm Kanone entdeckte, mehr durch Zufall, dass die Sprenggranaten, wenn sie insbesondere mit einer Viertelsekunde Verzögerung auf das Heck des T-34 geschossen wurden, entweder die darauf befindlichen Dieselölfässer zum Brennen brachten oder aber durch den Feuerschlag, der in die Gratings für die Ansaugluft hereinging, im Motorraum eine Entzündung verursachten.
During the early months of 1942, the Germans formed another 4 panzer divisions, giving them an actual strength of 3,300 tanks on the Eastern Front in May 1942. Armoured personnel carriers were still in short supply, however, and only 1 grenadier battalion in each panzer division was equipped with them, despite their new designation of Panzer Grenadiers. The other battalions continued to travel in lorries. The point of maximum effort of the 1942 German summer offensive was in the Kursk region. Army Group B, with 3 armies and 4th Panzer Army, was to head for the Don, then swing south along its banks, encircling as many Soviet divisions as it could in the river's great bend between Rostov and Voronezh. The Soviets, expecting the offensive to be resumed against Moscow, were taken by surprise when, on the 28th of June 1942, 800 tanks and assault guns of 4th Panzer Army broke through their lines in the Ukraine and struck across the rolling plains to the river Don. As always, the Luftwaffe played a key role. It had been ordered to support only the armoured spearheads, and an officer in Luftwaffe uniform was often to be found up amongst the leading tanks.
Man muss unterscheiden zwischen dem sogenannten Flibo und dem Stuka-Leitoffizier. Die Aufgabe des Flibos beim Korps bestand hauptsächlich darin, die Korpsführung von allem zu unterrichten, was die Luftwaffe durchführte, beziehungsweise der Korpsführung von Nutzen sein konnte in der Beurteilung der Lage. Während der Stuka-Leitoffizier immer an der Front war, meist bei Panzerspitzen. Der Stuka-Leitoffizier hatte sich meist morgens im Morgengrauen an den Brennpunkt des Geschehnisses gesetzt mit seinem Panzer. Hinter dem Panzer wurde eine etwa 1,5 Meter tiefe Grube in Pfeilform gegraben und in diese Grube wurde ein orange Tuch gelegt, damit die Sturzkampfflieger, die im Anflug waren, dass sowohl unsere Hauptkampflinie wie auch das feindliche Ziel besser erkennen konnten.
Ich entsinne mich an eine für uns sehr unangenehme Situation, wo wir gegen einen russischen Panzerabwehrriegel aus T-34 und Packflak aufliefen. Und zwar auf einem Gelände, wo wir uns so schnell gar nicht in Deckung begeben konnten. Da hat der Fliegerverbindungsoffizier, der ja in derselben gefährdeten Situation war, sofort die Stukas heruntergeholt. Und ehe das Panzerbataillon noch richtig reagieren konnte, hatten die Stukas den Waldrand, in dem die Panzerabwehrfront der Russen war, mit ihren Bomben belegt, sodass die Gefahr für uns ausgeschaltet war.
direct control over its reconnaissance flights and used them to seek out Soviet troop movements in plenty of time to plan the most effective countermeasures. Momentum was maintained despite Soviet attempts to strike at 4th Panzer Army's exposed flank as it sped towards Stalingrad on the River Volga with very little resistance, when Hitler made a fatal decision. He ordered the 4th to swing south and assist 1st Panzer Army in its crossing of the River Don. On the 23rd of July, the Germans took Rostov, gateway to the Caucasus. When, 2 weeks later, 4th Panzer Army resumed its advance on Stalingrad, the Soviets had just scraped together sufficient forces to hold the Germans and their allies on the outskirts of the city. The name alone, Stalin's City, was enough to ensure its special significance in Hitler's eyes, although the town itself had no strategic importance. By committing the 6th Army to the storming of Stalingrad, Hitler deprived his soldiers of their one advantage, mobility, while pitting them against the inadequately trained but dogged adversary, the Red Army infantrymen.